the Promised Land, and the Uninvited Guests. Hey guys, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, our journey will not take us to the ancient castles of Europe, nor to the blood-soaked arenas of Rome. Instead, we are traveling to a younger land, a continent of sun, of dust, and of promises, a place where, in the early 20th century, humanity decided to confront nature head-on with military force, and nature, in the form of a large flightless bird, responded with breathtaking indifference. This is the story of the Great Emu War, a real armed conflict where one side consisted of trained soldiers with machine guns, and the other was a flock of birds. It is a tale of courage, of desperation, and of the humbling truth that sometimes the most ridiculous enemy is the most difficult to defeat. So find a comfortable position, dim the lights. Perhaps you'll want to pull the covers up a little higher. Let your mind drift. Follow my voice back to the golden wheat fields of Western Australia, to a time when history decided to take a very, very strange turn. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the echo of another war. World War I, the Great War, was over. Tens of thousands of young men from Australia, soldiers who had survived the trenches of Gallipoli and the Western Front, were coming home. They had endured mud, gunfire, and loss. Now they returned as heroes, and the nation owed them a debt. The Australian government, in an effort that was both noble and pragmatic, made them a promise, a dream. That dream was called the Soldier Settlement Scheme. It sounds grand, doesn't it? In essence, it was a promise of a new beginning. The government would grant the veterans vast tracts of land, mostly in sparsely populated areas, so they could farm, raise families, and become the backbone of a growing nation. It was to be their reward for their sacrifice, a piece of land to call their own, a chance to turn sweat into wealth, to cultivate a future from the very soil they had fought to protect. The image transitions to the harsh, dusty landscape of the Australian outback. A simple wooden shack stands alone in the vast emptiness. But reality, as it so often does, had its own sense of humor. The land they received was no Garden of Eden. It was marginal land. It was arid, harsh, and perpetually colored by a fine red dust. The summers were scorching. The winters were cold. Water was a luxury, and the soil, though plentiful, was stubborn and unforgiving. This was a land that demanded patience, experience, and a great deal of luck. Ironically, most of these soldiers had little more than their courage. They were former mechanics, shopkeepers, and clerks who were more familiar with city streets and factories. The only skill the war had taught them was how to survive in a trench, not how to make wheat grow from soil that was more accustomed to scrub brush and stone. They struggled. They cleared the land by hand, dug wells with basic tools, and built makeshift homes from whatever they could find. Life was incredibly hard and isolating. The nearest neighbor could be dozens of miles away. Their only joy was watching the first green shoots of wheat push through the soil, a fragile sign that maybe, just maybe, this dream wasn't a lie.
they didn't know that they weren't the first inhabitants to try and make a living off this land. For thousands of years, another species had called this place home. A species that had watched ice ages come and go, that was perfectly adapted to the harshness of the continent. A species for whom these new farmers and their fields of wheat were not an annoyance. They were a newly opened all-you-can-eat buffet. And here, allow me to introduce our second protagonist, the emu. If you've never had the pleasure of seeing an emu, let me paint a picture. Imagine a turkey with a glandular problem put on the legs of a marathon runner with a long, sinewy neck attached to a comically small head. They look slightly absurd, like a committee of evolutionists couldn't agree on a final design. Their feathers are shaggy, gray-brown, and look like an old rug that's been left out in the rain. And they have large, round eyes, fringed with long lashes, which gives them a perpetually surprised expression, as if they've just remembered they left the oven on. But do not let their goofy appearance fool you. The emu is a survival machine. They can stand nearly 2 meters tall and can run at speeds approaching 50 kilometers per hour. Their powerful legs are not just for running. They are formidable weapons, capable of delivering a kick strong enough to tear down a wire fence. And most importantly, they are incredibly resilient. They are born nomads. Every year after their breeding season in the interior of the continent, they begin a great migration towards the coast in search of food and water. This is not a spontaneous decision. It is an instinct carved into their DNA over millennia. They follow invisible paths. They follow the rains. They follow the promise of greener pastures. And in the late 1920s, their traditional migration route suddenly became more appealing than ever before. Right in their path, a miracle had appeared: endless fields of wheat. For a flock of emus, this was the equivalent of wandering through a desert and stumbling upon a chain of free buffet restaurants. The farmers, our veterans, weren't too concerned at first. A few birds were hardly a threat. They shooed them, they yelled, they waved their arms. The emus, with their usual vacant expression, would perhaps look at them for a moment, cock their heads, and then resume the important business of eating. The fences the farmers had worked so hard to build, to an emu, a fence is not a barrier. It is a suggestion they politely ignore by walking straight through it. They have no concept of private property. The entire continent is their backyard. This minor annoyance slowly grew to a major problem. The flocks of emus grew larger, not just a few or a few dozen, but thousands. And then, as if fate had decided to test the very limits of human patience, another disaster struck. This one came not from nature, but from Wall Street. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began its suffocating grip on the world. For the farmers of Western Australia, this was a catastrophic blow. The price of wheat, the only thing they had to sell, plummeted. The government, reeling from the crisis, could not make good on its promises of subsidies. The farmers were now not only fighting the land, but they were also trapped in a spiral of inescapable debt. They had poured their sweat and sometimes their blood into this land, only to find their labor was worth next to nothing. Desperation began to creep into the simple wooden homesteads. Every single grain of wheat was now as precious as gold. Every stalk trampled underfoot was not just a loss, it was a stab at their last remaining hope. And it was at this lowest point that the uninvited guests returned. This time, it was not just a flock, it was an army. It was reported that in 1932, a cohort of some 20,000 emus marched into the Wheat Belt district. 20,000! This was no longer a migration. This was an invasion. Imagine being a farmer. You've mortgaged everything. Your family is looking at you with worried eyes. You look out at your field, which holds your family's entire future, and you see it covered by a moving gray-brown carpet of feathers, eating everything in sight. They didn't just eat the wheat, they trampled more than they ate. And by destroying the fences, they also opened the way for another, smaller, but no less destructive enemy: rabbits. This was the final straw. Their patience was gone. The soldier within them awoke. They had fought the Ottoman Empire. They had fought the German army. They would not be defeated by a mob of birds. They tried everything. They attempted to shoot them with their personal rifles, but ammunition was expensive, and an emu is surprisingly difficult to kill. You could hit one, and it would simply stagger, shake itself off, and continue running, carrying your bullet as an unpleasant souvenir. They needed something more powerful, something decisive. They needed professional help. A deputation of the ex-soldiers was sent to Perth to meet with the man who could solve their problem: the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce.
Picture the meeting. Sun-beaten, calloused men, their hands still dirty with the red soil, standing in a plush government office, trying to explain with a straight face that the nation's greatest agricultural threat was an overgrown ostrich. It would have been easy to laugh, but Sir George did not laugh. Perhaps because he was also a politician, and he saw an opportunity. Helping the veterans would be a golden PR move. It was also, he reasoned, a good chance for the Army to get some target practice. And crucially, the farmers had agreed to pay for the ammunition. It was a war with almost no financial cost to the government. The political upside was clear. The risk seemed non-existent. It was an easy decision. And so, a historic decision was made. The Australian Ministry of Defence officially sanctioned a military operation. The objective: the extermination of the emu population. A small military force was assembled from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. The commander of the operation was Major G.P.W. Meredith. Under his command were 2 soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Their armament? Not simple rifles. They were equipped with 2 Lewis machine guns, the fearsome automatic weapon that had sown terror on the battlefields of Europe. Each gun was capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. They were supplied with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Overwhelming firepower. A professional military unit. A clear objective. Their opponent? A flock of birds with brains the size of a grape. The battle seemed decided before it had even begun. All of Australia, and certainly Major Meredith, believed the campaign would be swift, clean, and decisive. They could not have been more wrong. The Great Emu War was about to begin, and history was preparing to record one of its most comical displays of military incompetence: the first engagement and the art of retreat. The decision had been made. The might of the Australian military, in the form of Major G.P.W. Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, and Gunner J. O'Halloran, was now deployed in the field. Their arrival in the district of Campion on the 2nd of November 1932 was met with a sense of profound relief by the local farmers. Here, at last, were the saviors, the professionals, the men who would put an end to the feathered menace that had plagued their lands. Hope was a tangible thing in the air, smelling of dust and eucalyptus. The soldiers, for their part, were confident. They had their orders, they had their gleaming Lewis guns, and they had an enemy that, by all logical accounts, should be little more than target practice. Major Meredith, a man of the military, saw the situation in clear strategic terms. The emus were the enemy. The wheat fields were the territory to be defended. His machine guns were the solution. The local press, catching wind of the deployment, dubbed them the Emu Killers, a formidable title for a formidable task. The plan for the first engagement was simple, elegant, and devised with the help of the local settlers. A flock of around 50 emus had been spotted nearby. The farmers, acting as beaters, would help to herd the unsuspecting birds into a sort of natural ambush, funneling them towards the waiting machine guns. It was a classic pincer movement, textbook military strategy, applied to birds. The men took their positions. The gun was set up. The air was still and hot. The farmers began their slow, careful drive, and the emus, blissfully unaware, ambled forward, 50 of them, right into the kill zone. Major Meredith waited. He let them get closer. The effective range of the Lewis gun was considerable, but he wanted to ensure maximum effect. He wanted a decisive, overwhelming victory to begin the campaign. Closer and closer they came. The farmers watched from a safe distance, their faces a mixture of anticipation and grim satisfaction. The moment arrived. The emus were at point-blank range, an easy target. The order was given. The gunner opened fire. The familiar, terrifying rattle of the Lewis gun echoed across the quiet landscape. For a moment, it must have seemed like a scene from the Western Front, but the enemy was not a line of charging soldiers, and they did not react as soldiers would. Had the emus panicked and fled together in a single, terrified mass, the machine gun would have been devastating. They would have been mown down in seconds. But the emus did not do that. Upon hearing the sudden, deafening noise, the flock exploded. Not forwards, not backwards, but in every conceivable direction at once. They scattered like a dropped handful of marbles, running erratically, their long legs carrying them across the open ground with surprising speed. The gunner, trying to track a single target, found himself aiming at empty space as the bird zigzagged away. He swung the heavy gun, trying to catch another, but it too veered off on an impossible tangent. The field of fire, which was meant to be a curtain of death, became a series of short, ineffective bursts into the dust. The gun chattered. The emus ran. The soldiers swore. After the first few seconds of chaos, the Lewis gun jammed, a frustrating but common occurrence. By the time it was cleared, the battlefield was empty. The survivors of the initial volley had vanished over the horizon, leaving behind a deafening silence. The soldiers surveyed the results of their first great battle. A handful of emus, perhaps a dozen, lay dead. The rest of the flock, the majority, was gone. A significant number of precious ammunition rounds had been spent. The element of surprise was lost forever. The farmers emerged,
their faces no longer filled with hope, but with a dawning sense of disappointment. This was not the swift, clean execution they had envisioned. Major Meredith, a professional soldier, was likely baffled. He had applied sound military logic to a problem, and the problem had simply refused to behave logically. The emus had, through sheer uncoordinated panic, stumbled upon the perfect defense against a machine gun, chaos theory. Undeterred, the military force moved on. A failure, yes, but a minor one. There were still thousands of emus to be found. 2 days later, on November 4th, a new opportunity presented itself, a far grander one. Scouts had reported a massive concentration of the enemy near a local dam. Not 50 birds this time, but over 1,000. This was the main force. This was the prize. A new plan was hatched, this one relying on stealth rather than herding. Meredith and his men crept carefully towards the dam, taking up a concealed position in the bush. The Lewis gun was positioned to command a perfect field of fire over the water source. The plan was to wait until the bulk of the Omu army had gathered at the dam to drink and then open fire. Trapped with nowhere to run, the slaughter would be immense. They waited. The Australian sun beat down on them. The flies buzzed. The minutes turned into an hour. Patiently, they watched as the huge flock of emus made its way towards the water, oblivious to the impending danger. It was a perfect ambush. The lead birds reached the water's edge. Hundreds more followed. The soldiers held their breath. The gunner's finger tightened on the trigger. This was it. This would redeem the failure at Campion. And then the Lewis gun jammed. Before a single shot could be fired, the metallic click of the malfunction, though small, was enough. Or perhaps it was a sixth sense, a primal instinct for danger. The entire flock of over 1,000 birds, as if moved by a single thought, stopped, turned, and fled. Within moments, the vast congregation had melted away into the landscape, leaving the soldiers alone with their silent, useless weapon and their mounting frustration. The final tally of the Great Dam ambush: emu casualties, 0. Human dignity, significantly wounded. It was at this point that a strange, grudging respect for the enemy began to creep into Major Meredith's official reports. He was a soldier, trying to understand his foe, and his foe was proving to be maddeningly effective. He started to notice their tactics. He wrote that the emus seemed to have a remarkable degree of cunning. He observed that they rarely stayed in one large, vulnerable group. Instead, they broke off into smaller mobs, making them difficult targets. More than that, he noted what appeared to be a leadership structure. Each mob, he wrote, appears to have its own leader, a big black-plumed bird which stands fully 6 feet high and keeps watch while his mates carry out their work of destruction and warns them of our approach. This was an astonishing observation. The commander of the operation was in effect writing an intelligence report on the command and control capabilities of the emu. He was no longer fighting a simple pest, he was fighting an organized army. His reports became more and more dramatic as his frustration grew. In a now famous passage, he lamented the birds' incredible resilience. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. Think about that for a moment. A military major was comparing the defensive capabilities of an emu to an armored fighting vehicle. The psychological victory, it seemed, was already tilting in favor of the birds. For several more days, the war continued in this farcical manner. The soldiers would spend hours tracking a group, only for the emus to scatter at the last second. They mounted one of the Lewis guns on a truck to try and chase the birds down, but the ride was so bumpy it was impossible to aim, and the emus, unburdened by machinery, simply outran them. Ammunition was being wasted at an alarming rate. By the 8th of November, nearly 2,500 rounds had been fired. The official estimate of emus killed was a mere 50. Though some argued it was perhaps as high as 200 to 500, even that higher number was a dismal failure. That was 10 bullets for every confirmed kill. Word of the campaign had reached the cities, and the press was having a field day. The headlines were merciless. It was no longer a serious military operation, it was a joke. An ornithologist in Perth publicly commented that the Army should be ashamed for fighting the bird that appeared on the national coat of arms. The public ridicule was growing. The government in Perth, which had once seen this as an easy PR win, now saw it as a rapidly escalating embarrassment. And so the order was given. On November 8th, less than a week after the first shots were fired, the military operation was officially canceled. Major Meredith and his men were ordered to withdraw. The first Emu War was over. The soldiers packed up their guns and their 7,500 remaining rounds of ammunition. They drove their truck back down the dusty roads. Past the fields, the emus were still happily devastating. They had arrived as heroes, hailed as saviors. They left in failure, defeated not by a superior army, but by a flock of birds who had won simply by refusing to die in an orderly fashion. Round 1 had gone to the emus. The war was over, or so they thought. The second coming and a grudging victory. The withdrawal of the military was not the end of the story. For the long-suffering farmers of the wheat belt, it was merely the end of a very brief and very strange chapter of hope. The departure of Major Meredith and his Lewis guns was followed by an immediate and predictable consequence. The emus, who had perhaps grown a little cautious, now returned with renewed vigor. They seemed bolder, more brazen. The threat of the machine guns had been a temporary inconvenience, and now that it was gone, the all-you-can-eat buffet was officially open for business again, with no bouncers at the door. The destruction of the crops continued, perhaps even accelerated. For the government, the situation was a political nightmare. They had tried to help, and in doing so, had become a national laughingstock. But the farmers' desperate pleas did not cease. In fact, they grew louder. The Premier of Western Australia, Sir James Mitchell, threw his considerable political weight behind the farmers, insisting that the government could not simply abandon them. The pressure mounted. On one hand, there was the risk of further public humiliation. On the other, the very real crisis facing the veterans they had promised to support. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the government chose the rock. They chose to fight the birds again.
And so, just 5 days after the initial withdrawal, a new order was given. On the 13th of November 1932, the military was redeployed. Major Meredith was sent back into the field. One can only imagine the Major's feelings on receiving this news. It was not a triumphant return to the front. It was a reluctant march back to the scene of his greatest embarrassment. This time, there was no fanfare, no hopeful headlines. There was only a grim sense of duty, and perhaps a burning desire to settle the score. But the Army had learned from its failures. The strategy, this time, would be different. There would be no more grand set-piece battles, no more attempts to ambush huge flocks in the open. The second campaign would be a war of attrition, a guerrilla war. They would be more mobile, more patient, breaking down into smaller units to hunt the emus wherever they could be found. And in a grim statistical sense, this new approach was more successful.
The killing began in earnest. The reports back to headquarters were more encouraging. The soldiers, now more experienced in the bizarre art of emu warfare, were able to inflict greater casualties. They had learned the birds' erratic movements. They had learned to anticipate their scatter-shot defense. The Lewis guns, when used in short, controlled bursts against smaller groups, were far more effective. The campaign dragged on through the rest of November and into the heat of early December. It was no longer a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding slog. A daily routine of tracking, stalking, and shooting. There was nothing glorious about it. It was hot, dusty, and deeply frustrating work. The numbers started to add up. On the 2nd of December, Meredith reported that they were managing to kill approximately 100 emus per week, a respectable number, certainly better than the first attempt, but the cost in ammunition remained extraordinarily high. The final report from Major Meredith, filed on the 10th of December, put the matter into stark perspective. He officially claimed 986 confirmed kills. This was achieved, he noted, with the expenditure of 9,860 rounds of ammunition. Let that sink in. That is precisely 10 rounds of machine gun fire for every single emu killed. Even this victory was, by any practical measure, a logistical failure. The cost of the ammunition alone far exceeded the value of the crops they were protecting. Furthermore, many of the birds were not killed cleanly. The powerful .303 rounds would wound them, and the birds would escape into the bush to die a slow, agonizing death later. Meredith himself estimated that a further 2,500 wounded birds eventually died from their injuries. But this was an unverifiable claim, perhaps an attempt to make the final numbers look more respectable. Even with the most generous estimates, the great military machine had, at immense cost, only managed to eliminate a fraction of the 20,000-strong emu army. The problem, while dented, was far from solved. In mid-December, the second campaign was officially concluded. Major Meredith was finally, and presumably gratefully, recalled from the field. His war against the birds was over. The government had had enough. In the years that followed, in 1934, 1943, and again in 1948, the farmers, facing renewed emu troubles, would again ask for military assistance. Each time, their request was politely but firmly refused. The Australian government had learned a valuable lesson. Sending the army to fight the national emblem was bad for morale, bad for the budget, and terrible for public relations. So what, in the end, actually solved the emu problem? It wasn't the military. It wasn't Major Meredith. It was a far simpler, more pragmatic solution. The government instituted a bounty system. They offered a small payment for every emu killed, encouraging the farmers and professional hunters to take matters into their own hands. This proved to be vastly more effective. In a 6-month period in 1934, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. The people who understood the land, who knew the animals' habits, and who were driven by direct financial incentive, succeeded where the army had failed. The ultimate solution, however, was not one of violence, but of engineering. In the 1950s, the government invested in the construction of proper barrier fences, specifically designed to be emu-proof. Infrastructure and exclusion, not bullets, finally brought peace to the wheat belt. And so, the Great Emu War faded into history, leaving behind a strange and wonderful legacy. It is remembered now as a perfect parable of human hubris, a cautionary tale about what happens when a problem rooted in ecology is met with a military solution. Major Meredith's name would forever be linked not to his service in the Great War, but to his surreal battle against birds. And the emu, far from being remembered as a simple pest, was elevated. It became an unlikely national hero, a symbol of wild, untamable Australian defiance. A creature that had faced down machine guns and won, not through strength or intelligence, but through a stubborn refusal to be anything other than itself. The dust settled. The guns fell silent. The farmers eventually got their fences, and the emus, as they had for thousands of years before, and as they do to this day, continued their long, slow, patient march across the vast, sun-scorched continent. And the world was left with one of history's most beautifully pointless, wonderfully boring stories, a perfect tale to help you drift away. Now, sleep well. Tonight, we put away the tales of military campaigns and turn our attention to a different kind of conflict, a quieter, more personal struggle. It's the story of what happens when you have a truly, monumentally bad day. A day so bad that it results in you being sent on a mandatory one-way cruise to the other side of the planet. This is the story of the British convicts, the unwilling pioneers who became the foundation of a new nation. It's a story not of great explorers or noble founders, but of ordinary people, thieves, pickpockets, and poachers, whose small acts of desperation led them on one of the most extraordinary and miserable journeys in human history. So, let the world outside fade away, settle in, and get comfortable. Let's travel back to the foggy, gaslit streets of Georgian England, to the very beginning of a journey that nobody wanted to take. Our story doesn't start with a grand declaration or a royal decree. It starts with something much smaller. It starts with hunger, or cold, or simply a moment of foolish temptation. Picture London in the late 1700s. It's a city of incredible wealth and grinding poverty living side by side. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke and river mud. Carriages clatter on cobblestones, and in the shadows of opulent townhouses, thousands of people are living on the edge of starvation. For these people, survival is a daily calculation, and sometimes that calculation goes wrong. The crime that lands you on a ship to Botany Bay is rarely a dramatic one. We are not talking about master criminals or cunning conspirators. We are talking about people like Mary, a young woman who stole a bolt of linen because she couldn't afford clothes. Or Thomas, a boy of 14, arrested for picking a gentleman's pocket and making off with a silk handkerchief. Or perhaps it's you. You haven't eaten in 2 days. You walk past a baker's shop, and the smell of fresh bread is so overwhelming it makes you dizzy. You see a loaf sitting unattended for just a moment. You don't think, you just act. You snatch the bread and run, but you don't get far. A hand grabs your collar, and your world shrinks to the size of a single, terrible mistake. Your crime might be stealing a wheel of cheese, or a single sheep from a rich man's field, or simply being found in a barn without a good reason. The laws are harsh and unforgiving. This is a society terrified of disorder, and the solution to that fear is to remove the disorderly, to sweep them from the streets and send them somewhere they can be forgotten. The next step in your journey is the justice system, but this is no grand courtroom drama. For the poor, a trial is a swift, confusing, and terrifying affair. You are brought before a magistrate in a powdered wig who seems to speak a different language. There is no lawyer to speak for you. Witnesses offer testimony you barely understand. The whole process might last only a few minutes. You are found guilty. The sentence is not prison as we know it. The prisons are already overflowing. The sentence is transportation. 7 years, 14 years, sometimes for life, to a place called New South Wales, a name that means nothing to you. It is just a sound, a whisper of a place on the far side of the world, a place from which no one has ever returned. You are now a convict, a piece of property owned by the Crown. Your old life is over, but your journey has only just begun. Before you are loaded onto a ship, there is the waiting, and the waiting often happens in a place of pure misery, the prison hulks. These are the ghosts of the Royal Navy, old decommissioned warships, their masts removed, their cannons gone, now rotting at anchor in rivers like the Thames. They are floating warehouses for human beings. You are herded aboard with hundreds of others. The conditions are unimaginable. You are chained below decks, in the dark, cramped spaces where sailors once slept. The air is foul, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and disease. Light and fresh air are distant memories.
Your days fall into a monotonous, grinding routine. You are woken at dawn. You are fed a meager ration of watery gruel and stale bread. You might be put to hard labor during the day, dredging the river or working in the dockyards, your legs still bound in heavy irons. At night, you are locked back in the suffocating darkness of the hulk. This is where hope goes to die. Sickness is rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and something called gale fever spread like wildfire through the crowded decks. Men and women sicken and die around you, their bodies quietly removed in the dead of night. You learn to live with the constant damp, the gnawing hunger, and the crushing boredom. You are surrounded by strangers, some violent and dangerous, others just as terrified as you are. Fights break out over a stolen crust of bread. Friendships are formed in hushed whispers in the dark. But mostly there is just the waiting. Weeks, sometimes months, spent in this floating purgatory, waiting for the ship that will finally take you away. And then, one day, the call comes. A transport ship has arrived. It's time to go. You are marched from the hulk, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight. You see the ship that will be your home for the next 8 months. It's not a grand vessel. It's a merchant ship, a repurposed freighter, its holds refitted with crude bunks and bars.
You are herded below deck one last time. The hatches are closed, the anchor is weighed, and with the slow creaking groan of timber, the ship begins to move. You are leaving England forever. You feel the gentle swell of the sea, the beginning of a voyage into the great unknown. Life at sea is a new kind of monotony. Your world is a small, dark, perpetually moving box. You share the space with 100 other souls, packed so tightly you can barely stretch your limbs. The only light comes from a few small grates in the deck above. The air is stale and heavy. The diet is bleak. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner consist of salted beef or pork, so tough and salty it makes your gums ache, and hardtack biscuits. These biscuits are infamous. They are as hard as wood and almost always infested with weevils, small black insects that burrow into the flour. You learn to tap the biscuit on the table before you eat it to knock the weevils out, or if you're hungry enough, you learn to eat them for the extra protein. Water is strictly rationed, and after a few weeks at sea, it becomes slimy and tastes of the wooden barrel it's stored in. Scurvy, the disease of vitamin C deficiency, is a constant threat. You watch as your fellow convicts' gums begin to bleed, their teeth loosen, their joints swell with pain. There is nothing to do. The days bleed into one another, marked only by the meager distribution of food and the occasional terrifying violence of a storm. The ship heaves and groans, tossing you against the wooden walls of your prison. The sounds are a constant symphony of misery. The creak of the ship's timbers, the wash of the waves, the coughs and moans of the sick, the distant shouts of the sailors on the deck you are not allowed to see. Months pass. You cross the equator, the stifling heat below decks becoming almost unbearable. You round the Cape of Good Hope, the ship battered by the violent southern oceans. You lose track of time. Your past life in London feels like a dream. The only reality is the darkness, the movement, and the ever-present smell of the sea and sickness. And then, after an eternity, something changes. A new excitement ripples through the ship. A shout comes from the lookout high above. Land ho! The sailors and even the guards seem different. There is a new energy, a new purpose. After 8 months at sea, you have arrived. You might be allowed on deck for a moment, a rare privilege. You squint against the brilliant, unfamiliar sun, and you see it. A dark line on the horizon, the coast of New South Wales. It is not a welcoming sight. It is a long, unbroken line of strange gray-green forest, meeting a white line of crashing surf. There are no signs of civilization, no welcoming harbors, no familiar church spires. It is a vast, silent, and intimidating wilderness. This is your new home, your new prison. You have survived the hulks, you have survived the voyage, but as the ship drops anchor in a calm, wide bay, a new kind of fear takes root. The journey is over, but the sentence is just beginning.
Welcome to paradise. The first thing that hits you is the light. After 8 months in the near darkness below deck, the Australian sun is a physical blow. It is brilliant, sharp, and unforgiving. It bleaches the color from the sky and bounces off the white sand of the cove, forcing you to squint. The second thing is the sound. It's nothing like the familiar hum of London. There is a relentless, high-pitched buzzing and chirping from insects you cannot see, and from the strange, drab-colored forests that crowd the shoreline, there comes the sound of birds. Not the gentle cooing of pigeons or the cheerful song of a sparrow. This is a wild, alien music of loud screeches, and a sound that seems to mock you with a maniacal, laughing cry. You are herded from the longboat onto the shore. The sand is hot beneath your worn-out shoes. This is Sydney Cove. This is your new home. It is not a town. It is not even a village. It is a chaotic, makeshift camp, carved hastily from the edge of an immense wilderness. There are tents, some already tattered from the wind and rain. There are a few crude wooden huts, looking small and fragile against the backdrop of the towering, unfamiliar trees. Soldiers in red coats shout orders, their voices sounding thin in the vast open space. The air smells of wood smoke, sweat, and the salty tang of the sea.
And there are other people, not convicts, not soldiers. Dark-skinned people with lean, wiry bodies who watch you from a distance. They carry spears and move with a quiet confidence through the bush that seems so menacing to you. They are the Eora people, the true inhabitants of this land. They look at you not with welcome, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity. You are as strange to them as they are to you. Their presence is a constant reminder that you have not arrived in an empty land, but have been dropped into a world with its own ancient rules, rules you do not understand. There is no time for reflection. The business of survival begins immediately. You are now officially in the service of His Majesty's government. Your life is no longer your own. It belongs to the colony. Your days, for the foreseeable future, will be governed by a simple, back-breaking routine. This routine is called government work. The colony needs to be built from nothing, and you are the building material. You are assigned to a work gang. Your task might be felling trees. The trees here are giants, their wood incredibly hard and dense. Your axe, made from soft English iron, often blunts or breaks against them. The work is exhausting, dangerous, and the sun is relentless. Or perhaps you are sent to the rock quarries to cut sandstone blocks for the first permanent buildings. All day you swing a heavy sledgehammer, the repetitive impact jarring your bones. The dust gets into your lungs, your eyes, your throat. Or maybe you are put to work clearing land for farms, digging up stubborn roots and wrestling with thorny bushes under the watchful eye of an overseer. The crops they try to plant, familiar English wheat and barley, often fail in this strange soil and punishing climate. The work is hard, but you learn quickly that there is no incentive to work hard. You are not paid, you are not praised. Working faster only means you are given more work to do. And so the convicts develop a silent, collective act of resistance. It becomes known as the government stroke. The government stroke is the art of looking busy while expending the absolute minimum amount of energy. It is the slowest possible swing of an axe. It is the most lethargic lift of a stone. It is a pace of work so leisurely it is almost stationary. It is the only power you have left, the power to control your own labor, to conserve your strength, to refuse to break yourself for a system that has already broken your life. The overseers, of course, are wise to this. Some are former convicts themselves. They patrol the work gangs, their voices harsh. The ultimate motivator is not encouragement, but fear. The threat of the lash. A flogging is the standard punishment for laziness, for insubordination, for almost any infraction. Your back will be stripped bare and beaten with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-thonged whip that tears the skin. The memory of the lash, or the sight of another man's scarred back, is usually enough to make you pick up the pace, at least until the overseer's back is turned. At the end of the long, grueling day, you are rewarded with your rations. This is the centerpiece of your existence. Your entire week revolves around the distribution of food. The rations are meager and designed only to keep you alive enough to work.
Each week, you are issued a set amount of salt pork or salt beef, so preserved in brine it is almost inedible. You get a measure of flour, often gritty and infested with weevils, a little sugar, maybe some dried peas. That is all. You have to make it last for 7 days. You learn to boil the salt meat for hours to draw out the brine, leaving you with a stringy, tasteless protein. You learn to bake the flour into a dense, heavy bread called damper over an open fire. You guard this food with your life. A stolen ration can mean the difference between simple hunger and true starvation. There is no fresh fruit, no vegetables. The specter of scurvy, which haunted you on the voyage, is still present here. And you cannot simply live off the land. The plants are alien to you. Some are edible, but many are poisonous. Learning which is which is a deadly game of trial and error. When the workday is finally over, you return to your home. In the early days, this is just a leaky canvas tent, shared with several other men. Later, you might be tasked with building your own shelter, a small hut made from a technique called wattle and daub. You weave a lattice of flexible branches, the wattle, and then plaster it with a mixture of mud, clay, and grass, the daub. The roof is made from bark or reeds. The floor is just packed earth. It offers basic shelter from the rain, but not from the cold, the damp, or the legions of spiders and insects that seem to find their way inside. There is no privacy. You sleep on a rough wooden bunk or a pile of straw, your few meager possessions tucked beside you, listening to the snores, coughs, and quiet despair of the men around you. You are a prisoner building your own prison cell. This is your new reality, a repeating cycle of hard labor, scant food, and crude shelter, a life stripped down to its barest essentials. It seems this is all your future holds, but there is another possibility, another path your life could take. Not every convict works for the government. The colony is growing, and free settlers and military officers are starting to establish their own farms and households, and they need labor. You learn of the assignment system. A convict can be assigned out like a piece of equipment to work for a private master. This is a lottery. It could be a chance at a better life, more food, better lodging, more humane treatment. Or it could be a ticket to a private hell, a form of slavery where you are at the complete mercy of a single cruel master, far from the prying eyes of the colonial authorities. And so, as you lie on your bed of straw, listening to the strange sounds of the Australian night, a new, dangerous emotion begins to stir within the exhaustion and the hunger. It is the emotion of hope, the hope that you might be one of the lucky ones, the hope that tomorrow might be different, a hope that in this harsh new world is perhaps the most dangerous thing of all.
Masters, mates, and the lash. To be a convict in New South Wales was to exist in a state of uncertainty. But the greatest lottery of all was the assignment system. After a period of working for the government, building the roads and barracks of the fledgling colony, you might be deemed eligible for assignment. This meant you were to be transferred from public works to private service. The free settlers, the military officers, and the government officials who were attempting to build lives for themselves in this new land needed labor. They needed farmhands, shepherds, stockmen, carpenters, and domestic servants, and the government had a surplus of it, in the form of you. The process itself was clinical and dehumanizing.
You would be lined up with other convicts, inspected like livestock at a market. A landowner would walk the line, looking you over, checking your teeth, assessing your strength, asking about any skills you might possess. And then a name would be called, perhaps yours, and you would be handed over to your new master. Your life was about to change dramatically. The only question was whether it would be for the better or for the worse. Let's imagine the best-case scenario. You were assigned to a small farmer, perhaps a former soldier himself, who has a small plot of land a few miles outside of Sydney town. He is a hard man, but not a cruel one. The work is still demanding. You rise before the sun and labor until dusk, tending to crops, mending fences, or watching over a small flock of sheep. But the work is different. There is a purpose to it that was missing from the government stroke. You can see the direct results of your labor in the growing fields and the healthy livestock. The food is better. You no longer subsist on the grim, monotonous government ration. Instead, you might eat with the family, or at least receive a share of what they eat. Real fresh-baked bread, mutton from the farm, perhaps even vegetables grown in their own garden. To a man who has lived on salt pork and Weevily biscuits for years, this is the height of luxury. Your lodging is a bunk in a dry barn or a small outbuilding. It is still a crude shelter, but it offers more protection and privacy than the noisy, crowded convict barracks. You are no longer just a number in a work gang. You are Thomas, the farmhand. Your master knows your name. His wife might offer you a kind word. His children might watch you work with a shy curiosity. A small measure of humanity is restored. You are still a prisoner, your freedom still a distant dream. But in the quiet moments at the end of a long day, watching the sun set over the strange blue-tinged mountains, you might feel a flicker of something that is not despair. This was the dream of every convict. Not freedom, not wealth, but simply a life that was bearable. But the lottery of assignment had its losing tickets, and a losing ticket could lead you to a private, isolated hell.
Imagine you are assigned not to a small farmer, but to a wealthy landowner with a vast remote property deep in the bush, hours or even days away from Sydney. Here, the oversight of the colonial authorities is a distant fiction. Your master's word is the only law. And your master is a cruel man. He sees you not as a person, but as a tool, a beast of burden to be worked until you break. The labor is relentless, far beyond the demands of government work. From the first light of dawn to the last light of dusk, you are driven without mercy. The food is worse than the government ration. Your master withholds it as a form of control, keeping you in a state of perpetual, gnawing hunger. You are always weak, always exhausted. Your lodging is a filthy hovel exposed to the elements. And then there is the lash. Here in the isolation of the bush, the cat o'9 tails is not just a tool of formal punishment. It is a daily instrument of terror, a dropped tool, a moment of perceived laziness, a word spoken out of turn. Any of it could earn you a flogging. Your back becomes a road map of scars. You are utterly powerless. To whom can you complain? The nearest magistrate is a day's ride away, and he is likely a fellow landowner and a friend of your master. If you were to run away and make a complaint, you would almost certainly be disbelieved.
You would be flogged for making a false accusation, and then returned to the very man you accused. There is no escape. This remote patch of land is your entire world, and it is a world of pain. In this brutal, uncertain reality, where the system was your enemy, and your master could be your torturer, a new kind of society was born. A society with one unbreakable rule: you must be loyal to your mates. The Australian concept of mateship was forged in the heat and hardship of the convict system. A mate was more than a friend. A mate was a lifeline. In a world where you could trust no one in authority, your mate was the only person you could rely on. Your mate was the one who would share their meager ration of tobacco with you, the one who would help you with your work when you were sick or weak, the one who would lie to an overseer to cover your mistake. This bond was sacred, built on a shared understanding of suffering and a deep-seated mistrust of the system. To betray a mate was the greatest sin a convict could commit. Within this secret society, the convicts had their own language, a slang known as flash. It was the cant of the London underworld transported to the shores of Australia. It was a language of secret words and phrases that the guards and masters couldn't understand. It created a private world, a sense of belonging and shared identity that set them apart.
And they found their own small pleasures, their own ways of reclaiming a piece of their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. They would gamble in secret, using shells or buttons as currency. They would sing mournful ballads of the homes in England and Ireland they would never see again. They would tell stories, trade gossip, and operate a clandestine black market for stolen goods. These were not grand acts of rebellion. They were small, quiet acts of survival. They were proof that even in the most oppressive of circumstances, the human spirit will find a way to create community, to find meaning, and to endure. And through it all, through the good assignments and the bad, through the years of labor and the loyalty of mateship, one dream sustained them. It was the dream of a ticket of leave. A ticket of leave was not freedom, not yet. It was a form of parole, a reward for years of good behavior. With a ticket of leave, a convict was allowed to work for themselves, to earn their own wages, to live independently within a specific district. You were still a convict, still subject to the law's authority, but you were no longer forced labor. You could rent a small piece of land, build your own life, and for the first time in years, feel like your own person. It was the first tangible step on the long road to emancipation. It was the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. It was the hope that kept you going when your back ached, your stomach was empty, and your spirit was close to breaking. It was the hope that one day this sentence would finally end.
The ticket, the pardon, and the ghost. The life of a convict was a life lived in waiting. Waiting for the day to end. Waiting for the weekly ration. Waiting for the sentence to expire. And the first glimmer of light in that long, dark wait was the ticket of leave. To receive your ticket was to be reborn. You were not yet free, but you were no longer a slave. The change was profound, felt not in grand gestures, but in small, everyday moments that had been denied to you for years. With a ticket of leave, you were permitted to work for yourself. You could hire out your labor for actual wages. You could feel the strange, satisfying weight of a shilling in your pocket. You could walk into a shop and choose what to buy: a bit of tobacco, a new clay pipe, or a loaf of fresh bread that you had paid for, not stolen. You could rent a small room for yourself in the growing towns of Sydney or Parramatta. Or you could lease a small plot of land and try your hand at farming, this time for your own benefit. The simple act of closing your own door at night, of having a space that was yours alone, was a luxury beyond measure. But this freedom was a fragile, conditional thing. You were still a convict in the eyes of the law. You had to remain within the specific district your ticket assigned you to. You were required to report regularly to the local magistrate, and you had to attend church every Sunday. A missed muster, a drunken brawl, any minor infraction could see your precious ticket revoked in an instant, and you would be sent straight back to the grinding misery of a government work gang. Life with a ticket of leave was a life lived on your best behavior. It was a tightrope walk between a newfound sense of self and the ever-present threat of the system. But it was a taste of freedom, and it was enough to keep you going. Years would pass. You would work. You would save. You would keep your head down. And then, finally, the day would come when your original sentence, 7 years, 10 years, 14 years, had been served. The end of your sentence was marked by another piece of paper. This was the ultimate prize. It was your pardon. For most, this came in the form of a conditional pardon. The condition was simple, but life-altering. You were a free person, but you were forbidden from ever returning to Britain. Your chains were gone, but your exile was permanent. You were free, but only here, in this strange sunburnt land that had been your prison. For a lucky few, an absolute pardon or a certificate of freedom was granted. This was a total emancipation. Your crime was wiped clean from the record. You were a free citizen of the colony, and you were, in theory, free to go wherever you pleased, including back home.
But could you? Really? The voyage back to England was long and expensive. The passage cost a fortune, far more than most newly freed convicts could ever hope to earn. For the vast majority, returning home was a financial impossibility. And even if you could afford it, what were you returning to? The London you left behind no longer existed, except in your memory. The family you left behind, had they moved on? Had they passed away? Would your friends even recognize the hardened, weather-beaten person you would become? The crime that sent you here, no matter how small, still carried a stain. You would return not as a prodigal son, but as a former criminal, a Botany Bay rogue. You might find yourself just as much of an outcast in your homeland as you were here. And then there was the land itself, Australia. This place that was once your tormentor had, slowly and imperceptibly, become your home. The strange laughing birds were now just the familiar sound of morning. The harsh sun was just the feeling of a summer's day. You had mates here. You had built a life here, however hard. You knew the rhythms of this place. In a way that you could never have imagined, you had put down roots in the very soil
you were once forced to till. And so, the vast majority of convicts, whether by choice or by necessity, stayed. They married, they had children, they became farmers, shopkeepers, and publicans. The former poachers became the new country's expert bushmen. The former thieves became the shrewd merchants of the growing towns. They built a new society, from the ground up. A society that was rough, pragmatic, and deeply suspicious of authority. A society that valued loyalty to a mate above all else. They, the outcasts and the forgotten, became the founding mothers and fathers of a nation. For generations that followed, this origin story was a source of deep shame. The convict stain was something to be hidden. Families would invent stories, burn records, and deny their ancestry, preferring to claim they came to Australia as free settlers, not as prisoners. But time has a way of changing stories. Today, that shame has largely vanished, replaced by a strange and fierce pride. To be descended from a convict is no longer a stain. It is a badge of honor. It is proof that your ancestors were survivors. It speaks of resilience, of toughness, and of a rebellious spirit that refused to be broken. The journey that began with a moment of desperation in a cold, dark city had finally come to an end. From the theft of a loaf of bread to the horror of the hulks, the misery of the long voyage, the bite of the lash, and the years of hard labor, a life was forged. A nation was born. The sentence is over. The struggle is done. The convict is no longer a prisoner, but a ghost. A quiet presence woven into the very fabric of the Australian landscape. A silent testament to the enduring, incredible, and sometimes wonderfully boring story of human survival. Now, sleep well. The fever and the flood. Hey guys, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we set aside stories of crime and punishment and turn to a tale of treasure. But this is not a story of pirates and buried chests of gold. It's a story of dirt and mud and hope. A story of what happens when thousands of ordinary people suddenly decide to drop everything they are doing, walk hundreds of miles, and spend a year of their lives digging a hole in the ground. This is the story of the Australian Gold Rush, a period often remembered for the giant nuggets and the instant millionaires, but for every man who found a fortune, there were 1,000 who found only disappointment, debt, and a bad back. This is their story, a story of gold fever and the cold, muddy reality that followed. So, take a deep breath. Let the noise of your world fade into the background. Let's go back to the 1850s, to a quiet, pastoral colony that was about to be turned completely upside down. Before the fever hit, life in the colonies of Australia was, for the most part, quiet. It was a predictable world of sheep, millions of them, a world of farmers, shepherds, merchants, and government clerks, a society where wealth was built slowly, over generations, through wool and land. The biggest excitement in a man's year might be the annual sheep shearing or the arrival of a new ship from England. And then, in 1851, a whisper started, a rumor. A man named Edward Hargraves, who had been to the California gold rush, had found gold near Bathurst in New South Wales. He had washed a pan of dirt from a creek and found it glittering with small, heavy, yellow flakes. At first, the news was met with skepticism,
But then came more finds. And then, a few months later, an even richer discovery was made in the newly formed colony of Victoria, near a place that would become known as Ballarat, and then another at Bendigo. This was not a rumor anymore. It was real. The news spread not with the speed of the internet, but with the slow, unstoppable power of a flood. A small article in a newspaper, a letter sent home, a sailor jumping ship in the port of Melbourne with a wild look in his eye and a story to tell. And a fever began to grip the quiet colony. Gold fever. It was an infection of the mind, a madness of hope. It whispered a promise to every person who heard it, the promise that you could change your life overnight. Why be a shepherd, earning a pittance to watch another man's sheep when you could be your own master and dig a fortune from the earth? Why sit behind a desk stamping papers when you could be holding a nugget of pure gold the size of your fist? Why serve drinks in a tavern when you could own the tavern? And so they dropped everything. The shepherd walked away from his flock, leaving them to scatter in the fields. The shopkeeper chalked the simple sign on his door, "Gone to the diggings," and locked it behind him. The farmer left his plow in the field. Lawyers, doctors, and policemen quit their jobs. Entire crews of ships docked in Melbourne or Geelong would desert, vanishing into the countryside in search of gold. The towns and cities emptied out, as if a plague had swept through them, and the roads leading inland towards the gold fields became choked with a human tidal wave. This was not an organized expedition. It was a chaotic, disorganized, and desperate flood of humanity. And the journey to the diggings was the first great filter, sorting the determined from the merely hopeful. Most people walked. They couldn't afford a horse or a cart. They would load all their worldly possessions onto their backs or onto a crude, rickety wheelbarrow. A pick, a shovel, a tin dish for panning, a small tent, a single blanket, a bag of flour, some tea, and some sugar. This was the standard kit for a man about to seek his fortune. The roads themselves were barely roads at all. They were rough, unformed tracks through the bush. In the dry summer, they were rivers of choking yellow dust. In the wet winter, they became impassable quagmires of thick, sticky mud. Wheelbarrows would break. Carts would become bogged down to their axles. Men would spend days trying to pull their wagons from the mud, sometimes having to abandon them and all their supplies. Opportunistic men with bullock teams would set up impromptu ferry services across swollen creeks, charging outrageous prices to men who had no other choice. The journey was long and punishing. It could take weeks to cover the 100 or so miles from the coast to the diggings. Men who had spent their lives in offices with soft hands and leather shoes were now sleeping under the stars, eating stale bread and walking until their feet were a mass of blisters. Many turned back before they ever saw a gold field. But for those who pushed on, driven by the fever, their first sight of the destination was something they could never have prepared for. Imagine emerging from the quiet, monotonous green of the Australian bush and seeing it for the first time. It is not a town. It is a sprawling, chaotic city of tents, a canvas town. From a distance, it looks like a field of giant white mushrooms stretching for miles across a ravaged landscape. The entire valley has been turned upside down. The earth is torn open, pockmarked with tens of thousands of mining claims, holes dug so close together
It's a miracle the ground doesn't collapse entirely. The creeks, which should run with clear water, are thick and brown, polluted with the mud and silt from 1,000 gold pans. And the noise is overwhelming. It is the sound of an entire city at work. The rhythmic thud of thousands of picks striking rock, the scrape of shovels against gravel, the rattle of cradles rocking back and forth, separating dirt from gold. And underneath it all, the constant murmur of thousands of voices, men shouting, arguing, singing, and cursing in a dozen different languages. The smell is of wood smoke, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and bad sanitation. There are no streets, no sewers, no garbage collection. This is a city that has sprung up in a matter of months with no planning, no infrastructure, and very little law. A few mounted police, the troopers, try to maintain a semblance of order, but they are vastly outnumbered and often corrupt. Disputes are settled not by a magistrate, but with fists. You have finally arrived. You have survived the journey. You stand at the edge of this chaotic, swarming anthill of humanity, your flimsy shovel in your hand. The fever that drove you here now cools in your veins, replaced by a dawning, chilling realization. You are one man with one shovel in a sea of 20,000 other men who all have the exact same dream. The gold is here, somewhere beneath this ravaged earth, but to find it, you first have to find a tiny patch of ground that no one else has claimed. You have to stake your claim. You have to start digging your hole, your very own hole in a field of thousands. Your new life has begun. The claim, the cradle, and the cold reality. You have arrived. You have survived the journey. And now you stand at the edge of the diggings, a chaotic, sprawling city of hope and mud. Your first task is not to find gold. It is to find a piece of earth to call your own. This is the ritual of staking a claim. The law, in its simple wisdom, dictated that any man was entitled to a small patch of ground. The size varied from gold field to gold field, but it was typically an 8 by 8 foot square, sometimes 10 by 10, a tiny kingdom of dirt. This small patch of the planet was where your entire fortune would be made, or, far more likely, lost. Finding an unclaimed spot is your first challenge. The most promising areas, along the creeks and in the gullies where gold had already been found, are a crowded checkerboard of claims, each one jealously guarded. You must walk the edges, observing, looking for a patch of undisturbed ground. You watch other men, trying to guess from their expressions whether their claim is a rich one or a duffer. Eventually, you find a spot. You pace it out, drive 4 wooden pegs into the ground to mark your corners, and get your miners right. A license for which you must pay a steep monthly fee to the government. This tiny square of mud is now yours, and the back-breaking work of uncovering its secrets can begin. Your tools are simple: a pick, a shovel, and a pan. The work begins with the pick, loosening the topsoil, then the shovel, tossing the dirt aside. You dig, hour after hour. The sun beats down on your back. Your hands, once soft, are now a collection of blisters that break, bleed, and eventually harden into calluses.
Your muscles, unused to this relentless toil, scream and protest. You dig through the topsoil. You dig through a thick, heavy layer of clay. You are aiming for a specific layer of earth, a bed of gravel and ancient silt called the wash dirt. This is the layer that might, just might, hold the tiny specks of gold washed down from the mountains over millennia. Once you reach the wash dirt, the real work begins. You shovel the precious gravel into a bucket and carry it to the nearest creek. This is where your third tool comes into play, the gold pan. The pan is a simple, shallow metal dish. You scoop some wash dirt into it, add water, and begin a gentle, circular, rocking motion. It's a delicate art. The goal is to let the lighter sand, mud, and gravel wash over the lip of the pan while the heavier materials sink to the bottom. Gold is incredibly dense, almost 19 times heavier than water. If there is any gold in your pan, it will be the last thing left. You swirl and you rock. You watch the muddy water spill out. Your back aches from crouching by the creek. Your eyes strain. You get down to the last few grains of black sand at the bottom of the pan. You hold your breath, and nothing. You toss the worthless sand aside and scoop another pan full of dirt.
You do this again and again and again. For every 100 pans of dirt you wash, perhaps one will reveal a tiny gleaming speck, a color. It is smaller than a grain of rice, but it is enough. It is proof. It is the fuel that will keep you going for another day, another week. If you are lucky, you find a mate to work with, or two. A lone man with a pan can only do so much. A team of 3 can use a cradle. A cradle is the next step in gold rush technology. It is a large wooden box built on rockers so it can be rocked back and forth like a baby's cradle. It's a 3-man operation. One man digs the wash dirt and carries it to the cradle. Another man continuously pours buckets of water over the dirt. And the third man, the cradle rocker, spends his entire day rocking the heavy box back and forth. The water and the rocking motion wash the dirt through a series of sieves and slats, trapping any heavy gold particles. It's far more efficient than a pan, but it is mind-numbingly monotonous work. Dig, pour, rock. Dig, pour, rock. From sunup to sundown. This is your life now. The feverish dream of finding a giant nugget has been replaced by the grim, aching reality of manual labor. You are standing in cold water all day, your boots perpetually soaked, your trousers caked in mud. At night, you collapse, exhausted, into your tent. Your tent is your castle, a flimsy piece of canvas stretched over a crude wooden frame. It leaks when it rains. It becomes an oven in the summer sun. The floor is packed earth. Your bed is a single blanket and a pile of gum leaves for a pillow. You share this cramped, stuffy space with your mates. There is no privacy, only the constant, close-pressed company of other tired, smelly, and often irritable men. Your diet is as monotonous as your work. The campfire is the center of your domestic life. Every evening you cook the same meal, a piece of greasy mutton bought at an extortionate price from the local butcher's tent, and damper, the dense, unleavened bread of the bush, which you bake in the coals of the fire. You wash it all down with strong black tea sweetened with gritty brown sugar. Anything else is a luxury, a potato, an onion, a bottle of beer. These things cost a fortune, sold by opportunistic merchants who know you have no other choice. Sickness is your constant companion. The creek where you pan for gold is also where you get your drinking water. It is the same creek that thousands of men are using as a toilet. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases sweep through the canvas town relentlessly. There are no doctors you can afford. A bad fever or a deep cut that gets infected can be a death sentence. And what do you do when the work is done? On the long, dark evenings, or on Sunday, the one official day of rest, the entertainments are as rough as the life. You might wander to one of the grog tents, illegal taverns selling watered-down, hideously strong spirits at outrageous prices. You can drink away your week's meager findings in a single night. You can gamble, a game of cards played by candlelight on an overturned barrel. The stakes are small pouches of gold dust. Fortunes, however small, are won and lost. Fights are common, erupting out of a drunken disagreement or an accusation of cheating. Or, for a quieter evening, you can simply sit by your own campfire. You might write a letter home, trying to paint a picture of your life that is more hopeful than the reality, ashamed to admit the truth. You listen to a mate play a sad song on a fiddle, a tune that reminds you of the green fields of Ireland or the cobbled streets of England, a world that now seems a lifetime away. And you live for the small moments of hope that puncture the monotony, the moment when, after hours of panning, you see that tiny, brilliant yellow speck at the bottom of your pan, the heart-stropping thrill of it. It makes you forget your aching back, your empty stomach, your leaky tent. It tells you to keep digging. But for every moment of hope, there are 100 moments of disappointment. The crushing feeling of working a claim for 2 weeks straight, digging a hole 10 feet deep, only to find nothing, not a single speck. This is a duffer, and you have to abandon it, fill in the hole, and start the entire process all over again, while listening to the cheers from the claim next to yours, where a man has just found a nugget the size of his thumb. This is the cold reality of the diggings. It is not a treasure hunt. It is a lottery where most of the tickets are blank. And so, on a Sunday evening, your one day of rest, you sit outside your tent. You take out your small leather pouch and pour its contents into your pan. It is the result of a full week of back-breaking labor, a small pile of gold dust. It looks like a fortune, but you do the calculation. You subtract the cost of your mining license. You subtract the cost of the flour and the mutton and the tea, and a cold, hard truth settles in your stomach. You have not made money this week. You have lost it. The gold fever, the wild hope that drove you here, has finally broken. It is replaced by a quiet, desperate question that you whispered to yourself in the dark. Do I keep digging, or do I give up and begin the long, shameful walk home?